Hey everyone, Xerath Diff here, back from a little bit of a hiatus. So don't worry, nothing's going on with the channel. We just had a family member in the hospital for a little bit, so it took some time for that. But luckily, everything is going well. So yeah, back to making videos. And the topic of this one is going to be Xerath mid versus Xerath support. Which one is better, right? And I see this come up quite a bit. And I feel like Xerath is not quite in the position of a champion like Vel'Koz, where the champion is primarily played support. I feel like for Xerath, most people still play him mid, but there's enough people playing him support to warrant a video like this. And I think it's a cool topic to kind of go over. And I think the best place to start is kind of defining what we mean by better, right? So there's two main things I can think of that's going to be on people's minds for this. And the first one's going to be what's better for climbing, right? And then the next one might be what is better holistically. So what I mean by that is if you could choose an optimal team composition to like drop a Xerath into, like where would he function the absolute best? And I think the answer for both of those is different. So if you want to stick around to the end of the video, that's cool. But for the people that just want the answer, I'll kind of provide it here. And then, yeah, if you want, I'll kind of go over everything in detail, obviously. We'll break down the pros and cons of everything. So I think in terms of what's better for climbing, I think mid, absolutely. We'll kind of go over some of these things in the rest of the body of the video, but just to kind of sum it up real quick, I think just the experience advantage combined with the gold advantage and combined with your position on the map, being in mid, being able to affect multiple lanes, it's just kind of like too much to really give up. Also, if you know that you're a good player, you're like, if you have confidence that you're going to be like the best player in the lobby or close to it, mid is a decent role for you. Because the thing is, like, having a bad mid is very, very hurtful. So if you go support or something like that, and then, you know, you have a bad mid or like an auto-filled mid or something like that come in, that obviously is very detrimental to your chances for winning. So there's some element of, if you really want to climb, betting on yourself and going mid. It's kind of the path of least resistance there with the champion. And in terms of what is better holistically, I think that support is just his best role overall. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit at the start here, and then we'll kind of cover the advantages of each. So I think a good question to ask after I say that I think support is his best like holistic role is why even play Xerath support, right? Like what does Xerath support do well? And I think the answer to this really is just very efficient damage, and you get to have that damage without sacrificing kind of like your mid slot. So you get like a long range poke threat that you don't have to necessarily full commit to. So you could full commit to in the sense where you put another poke champion mid, right? But you could also play something that's a bit more standard, a bit more playmaking, right? And you also get to benefit from having the poke of Xerath support. So I think there's a couple different ways it could work, for sure, right? But I think mostly it centers around the fact that you still do relevant damage for your role in the bot lane. And there's a couple of things that contribute to this. But basically, I think a lot of people would think it's a little weird because they see Xerath as like a scaling champion, right? And they know that he scales well with levels, especially now that his ult's been buffed recently. And they also know that he scales like fairly well with gold. So it's like, well, why would you play him bot where he's going to have less gold and less levels, right? It just doesn't intuitively make sense. And I think that there's definitely like a logic there, obviously, right, that makes sense. But the reality is when you play it out in the game, especially if you're using some like gold generation runes like First Strike, and you combine that with the gold you're going to get from the support item, you actually don't reach your first item spike that much behind a mid Xerath. And the first and second item spikes, in my opinion, are very strong points for the champion, and I feel like they're actually probably the strongest he'll ever be in the game. And it's weird because, like I said, people see him as a scaling champion, but in my opinion, is not really that great of a scaling champion anymore in Modern League. And the reason is because people are just too tanky nowadays, like especially after the durability patch. But there's also really great choices to itemize against AP champions in particular. And since you don't really have any reliable, consistent damage like Aurelion Soul would have with the breath, or you don't have any you're not a strong auto attacking champion, being Xerath, right? So you don't really have a way to deal consistent damage, like later on in the game, which means that the enemy buying a little bit of MR or something like that, like really, really tones you down. And the thing about MR is that in the mid game, a lot of champions don't really have a ton of access to it unless they're a true tank, right? Because they have to finish their core build most of the time. But as the game kind of goes on, even squishier champions like AD carries or some squishy mids can throw on something like a Banshee's Veil or a Wit's End, right? Or even a Maw in some cases, and bruiser champions can itemize these even easier. So basically, as the game goes on, I feel like you lose power relative to other champions in the game, and your strongest point is really that first item spike, the second item spike. And Xerath's support hits those two thresholds, obviously the first one quicker than the second one, not super behind what you'd have if you played mid, basically. And what that allows is it basically gives you a second mid laner for a decent portion of the game. And then the goal is kind of like, well, hopefully, since we have this double mid setup, we can parlay this damage advantage into a gold advantage. And then the idea there is that the gold advantage is what keeps you relevant into the later game, right? Also combined with how you itemize and stuff like that. So that's basically the idea behind Xerath support, is that in particular, you only need 5 levels in Q, right? So around level 9, you're going to be kind of at your Q is going to be maxed out. So you're doing your max base damage there. And once you have your Ludens and your support item and Sork boots, you're actually chunking people really hard in individual hits. And that's kind of like the bread and butter of this champion, right? It's to sit and to poke, right? And then kind of retreat and then poke again, and then retreat and poke again, and try and basically take people out of fights before they even start. And you can obviously do that as mid, but running him support, you get to do that as support with a lot more flexibility. And on top of that, you still have a more consistent damage mid laner, right? Or a fighter mid laner that can go in and make plays either way. You just have a bit more consistency in that mid lane while still taking advantage of the poke as support. So that's kind of what I would say is why in a theoretical scenario he's best as support. Now, let's go into the advantages of Xerath mid, right? And then we'll cover the advantages of Xerath support. So I think the most obvious one is obviously more resources, both in terms of farm and levels, right? There's not really much to say here. If you're having a decent game, you're just going to be able to outpace the gold generation that you're going to have on support, right? There's no question. Even with the support item, it gives a decent amount of gold and it helps bridge you to that first item. But outside of that, you don't get gold from it all game, aside from the passive, which is relatively weak, right? So you're just always going to have more farm and more levels in mid. And I think that the more levels aspect is particularly relevant because it's not really something you tend to catch up on as support. So a lot of times as support, you will end the game not being level 18. You'll end the game not even being level 16 in a lot of cases, right? So it's definitely a big deal being able to have your level 16 ult, as well as just finishing out the rest of the points in your E. But really, it's hitting that level 16, getting the extra shot in your ult, because the ult is just so powerful now, and getting that extra shot in particular just puts a lot of pressure on the enemy team. And that can really help you killing key targets in a fight, which is basically how you're going to win games, right? So that's huge in and of itself. And then There's a more flexible build path, I think, on mid, and I talked about this in other videos. But basically, the idea is that you can kind of try and lean in a bit more into the snowball angle on mid and try and completely take over a game, especially against more squishy teams. And then the idea is that if for some reason things kind of go wrong, they go sideways, you find yourself, this is going to be a longer game. You can build something like Leandri's later on. You can build a Void Staff later on. You don't have to build these items as quickly as you do on support because you're just going to always have access to more gold, especially if you're ahead. And so if you buy like a Shadow Flame or something early, a second item, to try and help you snowball quicker, right, then the odds are you're probably going to be getting more kills or contributing to more kills, which means that if you do need to swap things up later, that combined with your income from farming is just going to make it so much easier to do that. And then I think like the last major advantage to mid, this one's kind of an underrated one, is just the level of map control you have. Now, I would say Xerath is not the biggest presence on the map, especially early. But when I talk about map control, I mostly just mean the potential to help. I'm not necessarily talking about the fact that you're going to have like a stellar mid-jungle 2v2, and you're going to be able to fight every dragon and every objective, because Xerath is actually rather weak early, and in some cases, maybe playing him mid can get you into some trouble here, right? Because if your jungle is unaware of how weak he is, maybe your jungle can get baited in terms of, what he thinks you guys are able to do together. But I really just mean having the ability to enter into some of these fights and make some difference can be kind of like major in some of these games. Just the fact that you have an ult that has relatively long range from mid can be really huge because you can use it to help support your jungler in cases where he gets in trouble. You can use it to try and gank bot. You can use it to try and gank top from a distance, right? Be that little bit of a difference maker. So there's a lot of like flexibility you have to impact the map in some way. Again, it doesn't mean that you're a dominant force on the map necessarily, but it's just something where if you're in bottom lane, you can mainly like kind of ult your lane or ult mid, or you can maybe kind of roam to the center and then ult top or something like that, but you're kind of giving up a little bit there, right, if you do that. So as mid, you're just naturally in a position where you can kind of clear out the wave and then look to see, do I have a play bot? Do I have a play top? Can I help my jungle out in any way? So I feel like that's a very underlooked aspect, to Xerath mid. Now, advantages of Xerath support, right? It's weird seeing not having to farm here, right? But I think there's a specific reason I mentioned this on Xerath support. So this is not necessarily like a, if you're bad, you can play him support because you don't have to farm. It's more that, although farm is great for obviously getting you gold, it has a bit of a double-edged sword component to it where, obviously, in order to get the gold, you have to be at specific places on the map at specific times, right? And now, ideally, you're going to get to sit mid lane and kind of siege, and you'll be able to just clear the wave and then, harass people as you see fit that are coming in and around the mid, going to grubs, going to dragons, stuff like that. But the problem is sometimes you'll have to maybe go bot or potentially even top, right? Just because of the game state. Everybody coming mid to ARAM. This happens a lot. Even in higher ELO, this happens for multiple reasons. For people just wanting to siege mid. For people just getting frustrated for how their lane's going coming mid. Tilt doesn't stop at Emerald or Diamond, right? It goes all the way to the moon and all the way to the bottom of the ocean at Bronze and Iron. So, you can encounter these situations where putting yourself in a position to get farm is a little bit annoying because you're getting the farm, but now you're kind of like away from the action. And you don't really have this issue ever as support Xerath because once you finish lane, you basically go over to like the mid area around the objectives or dragon and grubs, depending on what's up, and you just terrorize people. and you don't really have any care or any responsibilities. You're basically just trying to do the most damage possible. You are trying to force people onto their side of the map, so your team and your jungler has kind of dominance over your side of the river, basically, and you're keeping them on their side of the map, not really letting them come over and contest objectives and stuff like that. So that's a really cool thing you can kind of do with support, and you can obviously do it as mid as well, but it's a bit more dependent on the situation. Again, you have to make sure you're getting your farm, right? Because if you're not getting your farm, there's no point in playing Xerath mid. So you have to keep that as your number one priority, and you're just going to miss out on poke because of that sometimes, right? Even the act of farming the waves, until you actually get really big in terms of damage, it's going to take multiple shots to clear waves. And, all that time spent sitting mid, clearing a wave, people know where you are. They're not going to get hit by those abilities, right? So that's time where if you're on support, you could be roaming around, just blasting people, essentially. So that's something I think is a bit underrated about the Xerath support. And another reason why, in like the optimal scenario where everything is going well, it's really nice to have that Xerath support, because this champion is just completely freed up to do its natural role, which is just to blast people with your Q. You don't quite have that degree of flexibility when you're playing mid. And then going down to the second point here, what would be in mid in place of you? Playmaking champion, strong early game champion. So again, this is what we talked about a little bit earlier, is that when you're playing support, you don't have to give up your mid slot to that poke mage that does kind of inconsistent damage. And also, Xerath is what you would call like a conditional damage champion, right? Like Vel'Koz, basically, or any other heavily skill shot based champion. So, your damage isn't guaranteed to land, especially against good players. And what that means is if you're playing him primary mid, sometimes it can be a bit of a struggle, because if you're expected to be the primary damage of the team of all times, then what happens when the enemy team has high mobility? They can just dodge some of your abilities, right? Now all of a sudden you're missing a large chunk of your mid lane damage onto somebody. And you don't really have the same problem on support, because a lot of the damage you're going to be doing, you can think of it as supplemental damage, right? You already have a mid laner, you already have a jungle, you already have a top. So the idea is any damage you're doing is kind of like extra icing on the cake, right? And that allows you to push the kill threshold quicker on enemy champions. However, if you do like miss an ability or something like that, or somebody's able to dodge things, it's not quite as detrimental, because you have that mid lane damage coming through, right? And another component to this is having a mid laner that can force things, and is a really big playmaking champion, especially if they have CC. But even if they don't have CC, they're just like a strong champion that can put a lot of pressure on. They can help you land shots, because they can kind of dictate the space that the enemy player can take up, right? When the enemy doesn't feel under threat, they're much more easily able to dodge your abilities, right? And if you're one of the primary carries, and again, all they have to do is dodge you, then it's much easier for them to play the game in that realm, right? Where if they're having to dodge like your Syndra mid, make sure they don't get hit by her stun, make sure they don't get hit by her R, make sure they don't get hit by her Q. Now all of a sudden they're having to play around her. It's hard to deal with that and have a Xerath ult come in on you. You know what I mean? And have a Xerath Q come in on you. So, allowing you to run these more playmaking champions mid is really nice. I think it also kind of doesn't pigeonhole your comp as much, right? And it also allows your comp to be a bit more flexible. And sometimes especially if it's a strong early game champion you have in mid now, these champions can kind of buy a bit of time for you to scale, especially until you hit that first power spike of the, your main item with your Ludens, with your support item and your boots. Having a champion that can kind of buy a little bit of time so your team's not just getting completely run over in every aspect until then can be really, really strong. And I think it's super underrated. So the next item on the list is the support item in terms of the advantages of support. And the support item is really great. It's strong. It does decent base damage, and it's got the percentage damage on top, so it even helps out a little bit versus tanks. And I think that what makes this item really good on Xerath in particular is how his style comes in of like wanting to fight. It is very much like poke you out, kind of like retreat. And the enemy is also going to be retreating from your poke, keep in mind, right? So although Xerath at times can be thought of as a kind of consistent damage champion, the reality of the situation is unless you're hard sieging and they're forced to stay in a certain spot to defend, when you're in the mid game, kind of like, poking around, trying to dissuade people from coming into objectives, a lot of times you're only getting like 1 or 2 shots at them, right? They see you, they're going to back off, run away. So, you might get like 1 shot from fog, you hit them, and you deal a good amount of damage because your support item procced, but you don't really have to worry too much about the fact that it's now on cooldown, because in reality, you're probably not going to get to blast them again anyway. And even if you do, you're maybe getting 1 more shot until they kind of run away, other people clear out, and by the time you find a new position, or they come back in to try and contest again, your support item is already off cooldown, right? So a lot of people look at this item and they're like, well, it is a nice chunk of bursts, but it's not consistently up, this item isn't really that good. I would rather just be mid lane and have more farm and, more component items, right, at this point than having the support item. But I think in reality, if you're talking about just single target poke in terms of, once every like 6 to 10 seconds, then support Xerath actually is very, very comparable to mid lane Xerath at 1 and 2 items. And this support item is a huge reason why. So, yeah, just a very strong item, and it really, really helps to give you that little bit of extra damage that you need to keep you competitive with mids in the game, or where you would be if you did play mid in that particular game. The support item is really good. And then the last one I'm going to talk about here in terms of advantages on Xerath support is the vision control aspect. Now, I think this one is a bit underrated. One of the biggest issues you have with Xerath is people diving onto you, right? And basically, how you have to deal with dives a lot in this game is you just have to be able to see them coming before they can even happen to you, right? Because the problem is champions just have too much mobility, whether that be even raw movement speed in some cases or dashes, and they can get onto you way too easily. So the only way to kind of thwart that is to see it ahead of time and move super preemptively and position yourself in a relative sense to your other teammates to make sure that they can't get through your front line easily, or if they can, they're paying like a severe price. That's kind of how you want to position yourself in the game. And the best way to help do that is to have a lot of wards that give you information. Now, the problem is when you're playing mid, you have a very limited supply of wards, and you may even be upgrading to blue trinket at the late stage of that game, which means that you don't have access to like a normal ward even. So the issue you tend to run into is that your support is obviously warding for the teams like holistically, and even if you're carrying, the support may not realize how important it is for you to have vision of certain areas, and that makes you very vulnerable to ganks. And when you're vulnerable in that way, it basically forces you to change your playstyle, right? Because how you can't play this game, especially in solo queue, is you can't say like, oh, well, my teammate is doing the wrong thing, he's not warding the right area, he's not peeling for me, therefore I'm going to do the same thing every fight, and then I'm going to get jumped on because these things aren't happening, and I'm going to die, but hey, it's not my fault because it's this other person's fault. You can't do that. You're just going to lose games like that. You have to be, you have to play your life, and you have to be as personally responsible for your deaths in the game as you can possibly be, which means that if your support's not doing the right thing in terms of warding properly, and your team is not peeling for you properly, you have to take that information in, you have to download it, you have to account for it, and you have to position differently in that game or in that fight, even if it means that you're doing suboptimal damage, right? Because the primary thing is you can't die, because if you die, you're just doing no damage. Very important for you not to die. So, in most cases, obviously there'll be some cases where you need to trade out your life, right? But by and large, you don't want to be dying a lot on this champion. And wards will definitely help keep you alive, but again, if you're not the one warding, it can kind of be a bit of a problem. So when you do get to play support, obviously you're wanting to ward for your team still, especially if your team's doing well, right? And you want to facilitate them as much as possible. But the good thing about playing support is that if you do notice you're getting jumped on, right, or people are really diving hard onto you, and you feel like you're carrying the game, or you staying alive in these fights can really help your team, because you're kind of baiting threats onto you while your team is killing their backline and they're dying and you're living, then you can use these wards absolutely to help you a bit in terms of staying alive. Because drawing tons of pressure like that is huge in games. It helps your teammates play, helps them create onto the enemy backline, right? Because now the front line's not there trying to disrupt them while they get on the backline. So being dove and being like a target can be a really good thing, especially if you have the proper vision set up. And being support gives you the vision, gives you control of the vision that you need, right? And obviously there's a delicate balance here. You can't be only warding for yourself, but warding for yourself can go a long way, especially when you're carrying the game, right? So that's kind of, I think, a super underrated thing about advantages of Xerath support. And then the final topic here is talking about laning on mid versus support. And this one I think is kind of where the whole aspect of, oh, well, if you're playing a mage support, you're just, you're afraid to take it mid because you're afraid to get bodied mid, basically. And to kind of piggyback off this, I think Riot August was asked recently if he thinks old champions in the game kind of hold up to some of the newer champions. And he was like, yeah, I think a lot of our champions do hold up, except immobile control mages. I think that's one of the areas where, the older champions start to get exposed a little bit. And he was talking about one of the reasons why mages, you'll see them go into bot lane, like Zyra, like Xerath, like Vel'Koz, is because they just can't play mid. They can't fight in mid lane, so therefore they go bot. And I think that this is kind of the prevailing thought, is like, oh, you don't want to play these mages mid because you're going to get wrecked. And I feel like there's a tiny bit of truth to that, but it's not in the way people tend to think. And basically, it's not that the champions get stomped in a 1v1 in the lane in most cases, right? Even Xerath's bad matchups in mid, I think, are reasonably manageable, especially if you have experience playing them. And yeah, I don't think that it's not really a situation where it's like, oh, wow, I'm fighting against Zed, I'm going to go down 0-4 and I'm going to be down 40 CS. It's not really something like that. And once you get a decent amount of AP, you can kind of just clear the wave fairly decently anyways, right? So that's not really a super big concern. But the area where I think what he means by Riot August means by they can't fight in mid, I think what he means there is, they're not good fighting with the jungler because they don't have good consistent damage. They don't have necessarily high burst damage, right? All these things that you kind of want in the early game when you're fighting around mid and stuff like that. So can they hold their own in the lane and just kind of farm up? Yeah, they absolutely can. But, they're kind of a more passive participant at that point, right? And a lot of the game has gone into trying to be as proactive as possible. And that's kind of like the antithesis of what you're doing when you're just sitting in mid on Xerath. So I feel like it's not necessarily that the laning itself is super hard mid. It's just the fact that you being able to contribute and help is not as good as like some of those other more playmaking, strong early game champions we were talking about before at the start, and then in the advantages of Xerath support category, right? And conversely, I think it's actually harder to lane as support. And I think that that's because the 2v2 tends to bring a lot more nastiness into the equation. It's way easier to die. Like, for example, getting hit by a Lux Q in mid, not the end of the world in a 1v1 in a lot of cases. But getting hit by a Lux Q in bot, if there's anything reasonable paired with a Lux, like a Kate or a Jhin, you are absolutely dead. There's just no question if they catch you in a reasonable spot, right? So, I think that it's a lot harder to navigate bot, especially because people tend to think of Xerath as kind of like almost like a Lux because they're mage supports, right? And they're just thinking like, oh, well, you outrange most champions in the bot lane, you poke them out, you do a lot of damage to them, you have the advantage early. The problem with Xerath is he actually doesn't do great amounts of damage, and his mana is very bad, and it's particularly bad in the bot lane as support because you're not really killing tons of creeps or minions, so you're not reducing the cooldown on the passive, which is kind of what helps you in mid sustain your mana. So what that means is you're kind of like this situation where you're not doing a lot of damage, especially because you're mostly taking first strike and bot as well, and you're also not having a lot of mana, right? So it's kind of tricky to navigate the laning phase. And even when you save your abilities to use with something like Comet or First Strike or Scorch if you take it, depending on what you take, you're still not gaining a ton of damage on each of those abilities. And a lot of times, the enemy just doesn't really see you as a threat, right? To really be dangerous, I feel like in Xerath support early in the bot lane, the enemy has to make a mistake. They have to eat like a really long stun. And your laning partner also has to be something that has good synergy with you. So something like Jhin, something like Caitlyn, even something like Draven, depending on the matchup, can be good just because he has a lot of raw damage, right? So if you do land that stun on somebody and then land the slow after, he's getting a lot of auto attacks on there with his Q active, unless he gets CC'd or something like that. So it's really dependent on your duo partner, like not necessarily duo, but you know your laning partner, and then it's dependent on their 2v2 as well. And yeah, in a lot of cases, you just are not the ideal thing. Like a lot of people love to play Kai'Sa right now, and let me tell you, Kai'Sa Xerath is one of the worst combos you could imagine. There's a little bit of synergy, obviously, with Xerath's ult and Kai'Sa's ult being able to dive on somebody, but that doesn't really help you before level 6. And, it's even at level 6, that's a bit of something you don't necessarily always get to pull off, right? So, I think, honestly, it's harder to lane not necessarily all the mechanical aspects, right? I guess when you take into account harassing and farming, there's a bit of skill play there in mid, but being patient in bot lane, proccing your first strike, not dying basically, you're a lot more threat in bot, especially when the jungler comes in too, because then it's basically like a 3v1 because you're so squishy you have no escape, and if you get caught in a bad gank with a jungler and the enemy 2 bot lane is present, you're dying, right? You have no way to get out. So yeah, I think it's actually harder to lane bot in a lot of cases as support than it is to lane mid. It's just that obviously on mid, sometimes you're not going to be able to contribute as much to what's going on around you, and that's going to frustrate teammates and stuff like that. But even being support, you're still going to frustrate your AD carry in the early game most of the time, right? Because he's going to want to go in, he's going to want to create an advantage because nobody wants to play AD carry even in League of Legends, which means that he's going to be trying to force the issue, and Xerath isn't particularly good at that, right? So just another reason why it's kind of hard to play bot sometimes, and it's sometimes just easier to stay in mid and farm up. But basically that's the video. Again, better for climbing, you want to go mid, and but if you want to play what is, I think, just the better overall role for the champion, it probably is support. But yeah, you'll just have more agency on the game as mid, and there's pretty much nothing you can do to get more agency, I feel like, on support, because you're just not a great roamer. Obviously you can do things at level 6. You're maybe a little bit underrated at level 6 as a roamer, but even then you're not an excellent roamer regardless, right? So you'll just have more impact as mid, and that's probably what you should do if you should climb. If you want to climb faster, at least. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. More videos soon. Like, comment, subscribe if you liked it, and see you guys next time.